All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this weird space that is online discussions. I would like to welcome everyone to the Women's Center Social Issues discussion for February 2021, focused on gender, care work, and the unequal impacts of the pandemic. My name is Nevena Ivanovic. I coordinate the Center's policy research and advocacy, and I will be your host tonight. To start us with, I'd like to share some Zoom etiquette. We are recording this session. As you can see, we will record it in speaker view only, so your face will not be recorded, but still, if you're more comfortable, you can turn off your video if you prefer. We also kindly ask that you mute yourself upon entry and that you remain muted. We recommend that you turn for yourself on speaker view so that you can focus on the person speaking, but of course it's up to you. There are a few of my colleagues and volunteers who are here to help with different aspects of the event. Jessica, Bobby Joe, Anna, and Chelsea. So if you need help with something technical or have a Women's Center related question, please post it in the chat. Also, please leave any questions that you have for our speakers in the chat box. We will get to them after our initial discussion wraps up. So before we start, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and their ancestors who first lived on this land and took care of it, where Calgary is situated. We acknowledge that we are all living on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. They include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, comprising of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley Nations. Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We also want to acknowledge that both our understanding and reconciliation are an ongoing process where we all have a role to play. On the next slide, we have our guidelines to a safe space that we use here at the Women's Center. I'll just give you a minute to review them. Even though we're in this format, there's still there can still be discussion in the chat. So we like to share them. And then moving on, here's a quick look at our agenda. So first, I'll introduce our speakers, Meriam Bravante, Rebecca Leong, and Naomi Lightman. I'll moderate a panel-style discussion with them for about 45 minutes, and then we'll move to questions and answers. So please leave your questions for them in the chat box, and we will collect them and feed them to them when the time comes. So we'll wrap up just before 7:30 to give you time to do a short feedback survey. Thank you for completing it before you go, because feedback is very important to us. So we are here tonight to explore some of the big issues many of us have been thinking about or reading about in the past year. On the one hand, the gender nature of care work, both paid and unpaid, as central, as one of the key factors that have contributed to the unequal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women. On the other, the disproportionate effects the pandemic has had on the health and socioeconomic well-being of Black and other racialized Canadians and Indigenous peoples. For women from communities that are marginalized by systemic discrimination, these impacts are compounded. We want to explore some of these impacts and the underlying reasons behind them with our speakers tonight. Before I introduce them, I just want to invite you to also keep an eye out on our calendar, newsletter, and social media for follow-up events. At the Women's Center, we will keep centering these issues of gender and racial inequality and the women who are part of our community who have been heavily impacted by the pandemic. Our next event in April will be a learning and participation-based event, and we'll focus on what a just feminist recovery that allows us to build different foundations would look like and how it would impact your life. I hope to see many of you there. So now on to our speakers. Let me introduce them to you. So first we have Meriam Bravante. She is a research and policy coordinator at Action Dignity. She is responsible for supporting the development and implementation of Action Dignity's public policy and systems change strategies and their research agenda. Currently, she is involved in the ongoing research and policy advocacy initiatives related to meatpacking plant workers at the intersection of COVID-19, essential workers' rights, immigration, and racial justice. Her work also includes supporting advocacy for more public participation in local decision-making and on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you for joining us, Meriam.
Hi, thank you.
Then we have Rebecca Leong. Rebecca has been working in the childcare field for the last 15 years. She's an ED of a childcare center and has a master's in education degree from the University of Calgary. She's also a graduate of the Max Bell Policy Institute program, where she focused her work on educator well-being, a topic she's very passionate about. She's also a part-time instructor at Bow Valley College and in the early, at Bow Valley College in the Early Childhood Education and Development Department. Rebecca also serves on a policy committee of A.C.E, which stands for the Association of Early Childhood Educators of Alberta. While A.C.E.'s main role is to advocate for caregivers and educators and represent their interests, her committee works to inform government policy affecting the educator field and aims to work collaboratively with government to develop it. And finally, she is a passionate advocate for the not-for-profit the provision of childcare services. Thanks for being here tonight, Rebecca.
Hello, everyone.
Naomi Lightman is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Calgary. Her areas of research expertise include care work, migration, gender, inequality, and research methodology. Her academic work has been published in a variety of feminist and social policy journals. In addition, she is the co-author of the second edition of the textbook, Social Policy in Canada. Naomi has collaborated on research focused on gender and inequality with various social agencies and government bodies in Alberta and Ontario, including the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association, the Calgary Local Immigration Partnership, Social Planning Toronto, and the Wellesley Institute. Her current research involves community-based interviews with immigrant women who are healthcare aides in long-term care in Calgary, examining how the pandemic has impacted their livelihoods, health, and well-being. Thank you for being with us, Naomi.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
So the way we've structured this is the following. We have prepared 3 questions, and each speaker will have up to 5 minutes to answer the question. After that, we will move to questions from the audience. Pretty simple. So let us start. The pandemic is often said to have revealed that the caring economy underpins the larger economy. It has also revealed the uncomfortable truth that many kinds of essential work are undervalued and poorly paid. So my first question is this. When it comes to the unequal impacts of the pandemic on women, how have you seen it play out in your work, your area of expertise, or in your experience? What has been the impact on women, and especially women from communities that are already marginalized by systemic discrimination? For this question, we'll have Naomi, followed by Rebecca, then Meriam.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Nevena, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Certainly, as your question implies, we've seen that women have really borne a disproportionate impact of the pandemic in terms of the social and the economic fallout. So just to kind of situate our conversation, I thought I'd talk about that a little bit, just in terms of 3 important factors. So we've seen that in terms of rates of infection, in terms of labor market implications, and in terms of unpaid care work. So just in terms of rates of infection, we've actually seen that young women, so women aged 20 to 29, have the highest rates of COVID-19 infection in Canada. And when we look at hospitalization rates, so more serious fallouts from the pandemic, again, we see that women are overrepresented when we look at people under the age of 40. And so when we think about what the reasons are behind this, certainly at least part of the story here is that women are overrepresented in service industries, right? In jobs that involve face-to-face interactions with people and have an increased risk of COVID-19 exposure. So here I'm thinking about jobs in healthcare, education, food services, tourism, and retail. So this certainly has led to disproportionate rates of infection for women, and specifically women in low-wage work, who of course are disproportionately immigrant and racialized and Indigenous women. Now, in terms of thinking about these labor market impacts, women have also been hardest hit when we look at job losses, so both permanent and temporary jobs. And we've again see this because female dominated industries, so again, jobs in hospitality and retail have been among the hardest hit by the pandemic due to social distancing and other changes in kind of how we go about our daily lives. And so women have really disproportionately seen their their financial status be hard hit. And we see this in the data that it's women who've lost hours of work are disproportionately women with young children and racialized women in particular. So all this has meant that women's labor force participation is actually at its lowest rate in Canada that it's been in the past 30 years. So we've really seen a major step back in terms of gender equality in the labor market. And of course, all of this, it will come as a surprise to no one here, are reinforced by the fact that we've seen a rise in unpaid care work. So some women have actually been forced to step out of the paid labor market entirely to take on caregiving responsibilities. So looking after children or elderly or disabled family members. And as we've seen kind of intermittent school closures and intermittent closures of daycare, seniors who are maybe unable to get home care access or other healthcare services in the same way, it's really women who have shouldered this disproportionate increase in unpaid work. So just to kind of shift gears very briefly, I'll just focus on a population that I've been working with more recently. And this is, as Nevena said, healthcare aides, immigrant women who are healthcare aides working in long-term care institutions in Calgary in particular. And this is research that I'm doing with the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. And what we've seen is that these workers, have been very hard hit by the pandemic in terms of their financial well-being, their livelihoods, and the health, their own personal health, as well as that of their families and communities. And when we look at healthcare aides, they are overwhelmingly a female workforce. And disproportionately immigrant and racialized women, and specifically Black and Filipino women in particular. And they're doing work that, even prior to the pandemic was very much financially undervalued. So these women make less even than their counterparts doing the same jobs within hospital settings.
1 minute, Naomi.
Okay, so this is work that even prior to the pandemic was very low wage work. It's work we often consider 3D work, so dirty, difficult, and especially during the pandemic, increasingly dangerous. And it's work that, at least in terms of the data, we see that Canadian-born and white women don't want to do. Yet at the same time as these women's, the physical, emotional, and health challenges have really increased in this work because of the pandemic, they've also experienced serious financial repercussions. So prior to the pandemic, many of these women had worked multiple part-time jobs just to make ends meet. And now because of the pandemic, they're only allowed to work in one long-term care institution because of course, very real health implications and safety implications of risk and the risk of transmission of disease if they work at multiple settings. But what this means is that many of the women that we're speaking to are now making somewhere between 50 to 70% as much money as they were before. And this was already low wage work. And employers are not willing to kind of turn their jobs into permanent full-time jobs because presumably of the added pay and benefits they'd have to provide. So just kind of to wrap up, I just suggest that specifically in thinking about long-term care, we've really heard the voices of more professional healthcare workers, so doctors and nurses, and we've heard the voices of residents and their families as we see a very real crisis playing out there with, of course, the highest rates of infection and the highest death rates, certainly within long-term care settings. But I think the voices of the workers themselves and kind of the implications for them financially as well as physically haven't been part of the conversation, and that's something that needs to be addressed as we think about kind of moving forward in the pandemic and hopefully in a post-pandemic context.
Thank you, Naomi. Rebecca.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I have a makeshift system here where I have set my phone up on a Kleenex box and a toy car to balance it so that you can see, because my computer isn't working properly. And also at the same time, I'm in my daycare center and they're vacuuming right outside of my office. So sorry about that for timing of this discussion, but I'm just going to hold my phone and hopefully nobody feels motion sick by the end. But basically, my points on this one particular question kind of come from three different viewpoints, and which I'd like to call the trifecta if you are a part of all three. So primarily we are a workforce of early childhood educators, which is the number one place that I've done most of my research and I spend most of my time advocating for. But of course, another part is the women that are using our childcare services. So we first and foremost come here to support all of our families and their parents, whatever that might look like for our children. And then the next step up is our workforce, which is 98% female in the early childhood field, who are some of are also parents and have children of their own. So then they have both of those things. My third point of view that I work with are the women that I'm teaching the early childhood development programs to, who many of them also work in the field and also have children of their own. So we're looking at a lot of different perspectives here, which I'll try to fit into 5 minutes, but I'll start with our parents. One of the large trends that we've really seen is that feeling coming back where women want to have it all, or they're supposed to be looking like they're having it all by being a mother and also by having a career. And so many of the women that we have working and using our childcare program are City of Calgary employees. So many of them would be considered to have, a profession that they might have gone to post-secondary for in most cases, but we have a variety of clientele, but just because of our location, that's primarily who we serve. And what happened was when we closed down and everyone had to have their children at home, there became this understanding that they should be able to continue their career, but also supervise or love their children at the exact same time. And one of the positives that came out of that was kind of the realization of what they had while their children were here, but also that it is a falsity that they could do both. Well, they can do both. Everyone can do both, but it was the ability to do it well. And what I was hearing from all of these mothers was that, basically they're compromising on everything and primarily their health. So their well-being was pretty much non-existent. They weren't sleeping, looking at maybe 1 to 2 hours of restless sleep a night, in between trying to fit in their children's schedules and as well as their meetings or anything to do with their work. And then if some of them had elderly parents living with them, or they were taking care of a disabled person, whether that was a sibling or a friend or a family member, that it was just not happening. And when we reopened, there were many people that were prepared to come back right away, no questions asked. And in many cases, we had managers reaching out to us saying, how can we help your program get back on its feet? Because we're really not getting what we need from our employees, but at the same time, trying to be supportive of them and having their kids at home and scheduling things at different hours. So one of the biggest differences that I've seen is a respect for people's time. over this digital age, the fact that everyone should now be reachable all the time, and because our workplaces take place in our homes, there isn't a lot of respect for that. Is somebody just said they wanted to give some input. Are we doing that now, or should we wait till the end?
We'll wait till the end. You can continue.
Okay. But the major group that I wanted to speak about was, of course, the females that are working in the field, which, I mean, at our workplace, everyone here is female. And a lot of, like what Naomi was saying, it's the same thing, the level of pay, the respect, the recognition for the job that's happening here, it doesn't balance out. And so when everything happened, when everything closed down, early childhood educators weren't considered an essential service provider at any point.
Rebecca, 1 minute.
Sure, thanks. And so that not even being recognized by society as something that was necessary came as a huge shock to those people using the services, but of course those people working. And then there was benefits for workers that were receiving wage top-ups in grocery stores and variety of healthcare fields. And early childhood educators weren't, they couldn't apply for those either. And the conversation was, well, if we weren't going to give them to nurses or doctors, or if there was a scale for wage, then we wouldn't fall on that scale. But the fact of the matter is, most childcare workers or educators make the same as those working in the grocery stores. Minimum wage is average for childcare services. So the frustrating part was, now there's no recognition and there's no support. And for a lot of people, they haven't even been able to return to their workplaces because we don't have the enrollment to bring back all of our staff. So I think those are the biggest impacts that we have seen, is that 80% of the field, 20% of the field hasn't even returned to work or may not ever return to their jobs. So for an already low amount or required number of educators in the field, we're losing more as it goes, and they're dealing with all of these hardships and trying to support their own families. They can't even afford the services that we're providing for themselves. All of the educators that work in my program had to find alternative childcare measures because they couldn't afford to pay for childcare while they were working in childcare. So very, very many more gaps that we were seeing that we already had before have incrementally grown, especially for early childhood educators in the field. I think I'll stop there. We'll get into the students. There's not enough time.
Thank you. Meriam.
Now it's my time to humanize the stories of these care workers. Good evening, everyone. It's my honor to be here, and thanks to the Women's Center for hosting this event and for extending the invitation. First off, I would like to acknowledge the racialized essential workers, especially those in the healthcare sector, the grocery clerks, and meatpacking plant workers. They contribute not only to our economy, but to the overall vitality and health of our communities. While I'm going to center my conversation around the intersection of benign immigrant care work, colonialism, and racism, I would like to acknowledge as well that this is Black History Month, and I offer my solidarity to the Black women and men who are here right now or elsewhere. Now, I would like to tell the story of my friend Gemma. We went to the same high school in the Philippines, an all-girls Catholic high school run by the Dominican Sisters of the Order of Preachers, a religious institutional remnant of the 300 plus or so years of Spanish colonization as well as American occupation of the Philippine archipelago. Gemma, who studied a nurse in the Philippines to work abroad, her husband and her two young boys at that time, ages 7 and 8, rent a basement suite from another Filipino family in the Greater Forest Lawn area, the so-called working immigrant hub of Calgary. So just a month before COVID, Gemma was forced to quit her job as a care provider in a private group care home. Gemma worked for 10 years in that same facility. There were 14 of them employed, all Filipinas, or we call it Pinays. Gemma describes her work arrangement there as 3 days on, 3 days off, meaning they will live in the facility for 3 days and will have 3 days off work after that. So for the 3 days or 72 hours spent living in the care home, her total paid hours is 48 hours for a minimum wage of $15 per hour. But in order to pull this off, Gemma had to hire her own babysitter for her young boys while she lived in the home care facility located just 10 minutes away from her place. At times, she and her husband would just leave the boys with the landlord upstairs. She said, and I quote, "They became self-reliant at a young age." To backtrack, in 2017, there was a change in management and a new set of rules and pay scheme was introduced in her workplace. Gemma's co-worker started to inquire about the workers' rights and employment standards on what she believed to be an unjust and discriminatory practice against them as Filipino care workers. Gemma's co-worker was abruptly terminated without cause, together with her mother who also worked there. The mother-daughter hired a lawyer to help them understand their rights and navigate the employment system, and that's a lot of money for them. Later on, Gemma learned that the case was settled out of court and the mother and daughter had to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the company, thus prevented them from talking about the issue. The new work arrangement was also taking a toll on Gemma's physical and mental health. She believed at the time that her work had become even more precarious and unjust. She also felt guilty as a mother that she couldn't take care of her young boys. Gemma, like most Pinay immigrants, would send money to the Philippines to help in the care for her sick father. When they signed a contract as care provider, their specific duties were listed relating to care of clients. However, the management later would require them to do all kinds of work unrelated to health, to the care of clients: mow the lawn, gardening, snow shoveling, house cleaning, you name it. Together with her co-worker, she went to Alberta Employment Standards Office for advice, even though they were so afraid that once the management learns about them inquiring, they will meet the same retaliation suffered by her co-workers. And it happened. One co-worker was too afraid to lose her job, informed the manager. On the very next day, Gemma and 3 others were terminated for no cause. No notice was given, or the notice was given on the same day she was terminated. So Gemma's termination also happened just when the COVID outbreak hit Canada. Since then, she does unpaid work to take care of her sons, which she termed as making up for the lost times with them while she was working. With COVID, she finds it harder to find a job, and her kids are doing online schooling right now. She has been spending 3 hours per child to help them with their assignments because online schooling is apparently more is harder for mothers to deal with their kids, to help their kids. So according to Gemma, the pandemic makes life harder as an immigrant care worker, whether you are paid or whether it is paid or unpaid. That's all I have to share for now.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. You all told us about the unequal impacts from really different perspectives, and thank you for that. And now let's just go into the why. What are some underlying reasons why this has happened and is happening? For this question, we will start with Rebecca, continue with Meriam, and then end with Naomi.
I'm still thinking about what you two said. There's so much perspective to think about. So I really appreciate being part of this. So I guess some of the underlying reasons why, if I'm going to focus on the workforce, which I would say is the area that I know the most about, is that typically policy in the past has not recognized the workforce as an important part of childcare. Only in recent years have we even changed some of the dialogue in the recent legislation or the regulations that were released to reflect children's mental health and children's well-being. So it's a far stretch to even get to educator well-being at this point. But what we do know is that the workforce is made up largely of diverse women from all different places. And a lot of the, the largest percentage of the workforce is also Filipino. And the biggest amount of spoken second language in the field is also Tagalog. So I find that really interesting how that is also something in other similar fields. But a lot of the recognition that we're looking for is we can find that in the work that we're doing. And when we talk about the percentage of women that feel job satisfaction, if you rate it as job satisfaction towards what the job actually is in caring for children and in their mental health and the relationships we build with them, the relationships we build with the families, a percentage is high. Job satisfaction is high. But on the flip side, what makes it bad are the working conditions, the wages, and the ability to do what we perceive is quality work. And when we don't have the time or the space to do what we think is quality, then we aren't able to connect those things that we find are important values or why we've chosen to do this work in the first place. And so when I spoke earlier about respecting time, I'm finding that also the same with our educators. And there is this expectation that now that legislation has changed to encourage these principles to be considered, and quality is a part of that. It's kind of putting this responsibility on the educators to find this quality and to be performing it. Based on just the word itself, but any of the infrastructure behind that to actually support that development isn't there, and it's also moving away from having things like accreditation that guarantee certain things are in place, to know that we, for example, respect the diverse culture of those children using our services or those families, as well as the educators working in the field. And it's not to say that programs aren't going to be doing that moving forward, but there's just nothing behind saying that that's going to happen at all. And then on top of that, before, when there were those measures or those protections in place that the government was monitoring, and in turn backing that up with a wage top up, for example, the wage top up is still there, but then there isn't this accountability for holding on to quality the same way that there used to be, which means it now becomes the parents' full responsibility to understand what quality is, to seek that quality out, and to ensure that the place that they've put their child is actually doing what that perceived quality might be. So there's these gaps on all these different ends of, we've changed the language, for example, and we have now added educators to the essential service list, or the frontline service work, I guess, but it hasn't changed structurally in a way where post-secondaries have a combined sense of what core competency should be. There isn't a level of requirement that is equal to somebody who has a full diploma or full degree to practice. You can take a 50-hour orientation course and be treated exactly the same. And so with this huge gap that shows you can have a variety of background to work in the field, it shows that it doesn't really matter generally to society what education you have. So the motivation, to obtain that education and to continue for best practice is low, especially in a time like this pandemic where well-being is low, working conditions are low, coping abilities are low, and the idea that we're supposed to be doing more is present. So I think that is why we're seeing this. We're seeing high levels of burnout. We're seeing even higher levels of people leaving the field than there were before. And those that are, hoping to enter the field are either struggling to pay for education, because once you do, it's still going to be multiple years for you to be able to pay off your student loans or your student debt, if that was the case that you pursued. And then to see that you can have the same job whether you pursue that degree or don't, it changes that perspective. And then you have people learning in the field, and then the other expectation of the mentoring coming from those educators who are already doing everything they possibly can to meet those children's needs, clean every doorknob 17,000 times in the day, and also communicate what they're doing in a way that makes sense to their families when their families don't have time because they're so overwhelmed with all the workloads that they have, which is, so we're finding that everybody's working late and everybody's working overtime, including our clients, just as much as our educators. So I think that's why we're seeing these huge gaps and huge levels of burnout.
Thanks, Rebecca. Meriam.
And since we already started talking about essential workers, who are now we find out that they are largely composed of immigrant workers, and specifically Pinay immigrant workers. I would like to show you, to share my screen to give you a global context of how Filipinos and Filipina care workers are ubiquitous in every service industry related, not only in Canada, but all over the world. When I traveled to Europe, one time I went to the hotel and those who would be there are Filipinos. And I went to the train station, it's the same, who go to the restaurants. But in Canada, why is this happening? Share my screen. I hope I will be sharing.
Yeah, you're good. Just need to go to the presentation. Just go to the presentation.
You cannot see my notes, right?
No, we can. So you should go to the presentation icon.
Okay, hang on. Where do I go?
Just the little icon at the bottom. Just the little icon at the bottom that looks like a cup.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then right click for your notes. Yeah.
Thank you, Nivna.
Oh no. We
So
can actually
I'm
see
largely
them.
using this book, Migrants for Export, How the Philippine State Brokers Labored to the Entire World by Robin Magalit Rodriguez.
Meriam, sorry, we can actually see the presenter view. I'm not sure why that's happening.
Okay, what do I do with this one? That's a very...
Maybe just stop sharing and maybe just try again.
Okay, okay, no, stop sharing. Am I still sharing?
No, you're not, you're good.
Okay. Maybe I can just talk about it without showing you the slides. But anyway, that's the book about Robin Magalit Rodriguez, which talks about the connection between neoliberalism and the Philippines as what she coins as the labor brokerage state. It is a neoliberal strategy wherein the Philippine state mobilizes its citizens, send them to work all over the world, while generating profits from migrant workers' remittances. And they would be sending back to their families and loved ones who are left behind in the Philippines. The Philippines has a very good mechanism in providing labor to the entire world through the Philippine Overseas Employment Agency, and it has a website recently that announced there are 400,000 OFWs, or overseas foreign workers, who are sent home during the pandemic. There's a virtual fair for wannabe OFWs and prospective employers. And in the old version of the brochure that that the Philippine government has been distributing, it's called Able Minds, Able Hands to Foreign Lands, the Filipino worker. You see, when I talk of the Philippines, the Philippines stopped being the top exporter of sugarcane, coconuts, hemp, or abaca and other raw materials. It has decided to export 10% of its population. Right now, we're more than 110 million in that tiny archipelago, to prop up its economy and in service to this very aggressive type of capitalism, the neoliberalism. So to backtrack a bit, when the American colonizers encountered Filipinos in 1898, they perpetrated this prejudice that the Spanish conquistadors have started, that Filipinos are backward and savage. In one US Supreme Court decision, for example, Filipinos were referred to as non-Christian tribes. They are uncivilized, backward people with barbarous practices, and quoting the Supreme Court of the United States here in one decision, they are of low order of intelligence. So what I'm saying here is that the recent challenges of bias and racism that immigrant Filipinas workers, specifically Filipino Canadians like Gemma, should not be divorced from this historical context of colonization and neoliberalism. How does brokering labor work? So the Philippine state negotiates with, say, the government of Canada, that is the labor receiving state, to formalize this send-off of migrant workers. So it makes it easier for employers around the world to avail themselves of the cheap temporary labor. And when the workers' temporary work visas expire, they can return to their motherland and hailed as modern heroes. One Filipino intellectual appropriately said this, that the Philippine state engages in nothing more than illegal human trafficking. I would like to show you some slides about how the big what do you call this, ad at the airport of how the Filipino overseas workers are hailed as heroes, but working abroad and remittances is considered as an act of nationalism. That's the rhetoric that the Philippine government is using.
You have
It
1
has
minute,
shifted-
1 minute, Meriam.
It has shifted from brain drain to represent migrants as national heroes. But heroism here comes with responsibilities. They are expected to be law-abiding, hardworking, uncomplaining. We are matisin, or in Filipino, or resilient. We are the model minority and representative of the Philippine state abroad. So when they return home, when their visas expire. And what happens when you fail to do your nationalistic duties? The Philippine state uses many mechanisms of control. Number one is citizenship. It becomes a means to regulate migrants. Well, to get their remittances. And if you are an unruly migrant worker, you have to be sent back to the Philippines. So that's one shot at explaining the context. There will be more, but we can talk about it in maybe in the next round of questions.
Okay, thank you. Naomi.
Okay, so, I think one thing that maybe we're all getting at on this panel here is that the pandemic has not so much created inequalities, it's simply really exacerbated them or made them worse. So prior to the pandemic, we know, as Meriam has so aptly stated, that our labor market was structured by inequalities within a context of neoliberalism that is stratified by race, by citizenship status, by gender, by class, and of course by intersections between them. And so what we see as kind of the inevitable result of that is that in the pandemic, racialized and immigrant women are the ones who've been hit hardest. And of course, one of the main reasons for this, as we're all getting at again here, is really that as a society, we rely so heavily on women to provide care for children, for elderly people, for people experiencing disabilities, really for everyone at some point in their life when we need care. And as we've seen school closures, as we've seen, people shifting to working from home in some cases or losing their jobs, we've really lost access to a lot of health and social services that typically as a society we rely on. So I think it's not dramatic to say that we're really in a care crisis. We're in a crisis of caregiving right now. And if we think again about healthcare aides in long-term care, so kind of my research focus right now, we know that these workers are especially vulnerable because they're doing frontline work in a very high-risk environment. And they're also made especially vulnerable because of their gender, their race, their citizenship status, and their class. So in long-term care, we really do have a scenario where it's kind of, we have the most vulnerable workers doing the most essential services for extremely vulnerable clients under very difficult and troubling working conditions. So it's kind of all coming together. And some of the reasons behind this, to get at your question, Nevena, more so, is really structures that we see in the labor market. So when we think about healthcare aides again, these women are doing essential labor, but a lot of times they're working without the things that they need, especially during the pandemic, just to kind of go about their daily lives. So here I'm talking about things like having appropriate levels of PPE. That's obviously something that's gotten better as the pandemic has gone on, but that was a real concern at the start of the pandemic. Paid sick leave is something that many of these workers don't have or don't have adequate amounts of. Appropriate staffing ratios within long-term care is a real concern. And again, the pandemic has made their work more difficult because they have to, as Rebecca said, for childcare workers, re-sanitize things 16 times. They have to put on PPE and take off PPE every single time they move from client to client. And there really hasn't been a recognition of the increased workload that these women are taking on, specifically because of the pandemic context. Certainly, we've seen, as I said, many of these women have, their wages have actually decreased, notwithstanding any top up, because they're not able to work in multiple locations anymore. And we also see that many of these workers are challenged even in terms of having safe transportation to and from work. Not everyone has a car that they can safely get to work. Especially not, by themselves or just with people in their immediate family. And of course, childcare. That's a thing that, many women rely on in order to do their paid labor. And that's not necessarily something that is available to them prior to the pandemic or especially now. So all of these factors have led to these inequalities that we see in terms of health and workplace outcomes for long-term care workers, for healthcare aides, but also for other low-wage workers as well. And, one other thing I'd say is that we really don't, I think there's been some improvement, but we don't have adequate race-based data collection in terms of who is doing what type of work and in terms of COVID infection rates and health outcomes. So in some ways, we don't even know the extent of the problem. And we really need to have that data in order to move towards having policies that can address these disparities. And I think we've talked about the wage top up and how that's something that, of course, is necessary, but is not sufficient and hasn't really made up for financial implications that many workers have experienced. And even, we can think more recently about Jason Kenney just announcing this one-time payment of $1,200 for essential workers. And I think for most of us, that seems like much too little too late. That isn't going to be enough to make up for childcare expenses, for, lost hours of work, for the fact that people are now caring perhaps for elderly family members. So, I think I'm out of time here, but I think that all of these factors, all of these structural inequalities in the labor market that Meriam really spoke about are all leading to scenarios where we just see that these inequalities are being exacerbated during the pandemic context.
Thank you. Thank you all. Wow, that's a lot. I mean, when we put the panel together, it was, we were talking about, and we know we wanted to talk about the underappreciation and devaluation of care and other types of essential work and often work that is, as seen as low, quote unquote, low skilled work. But there's so much, and thank you all for providing so much context and kind of showing us how that devaluation and undervaluation, how it really manifests itself, and whether it's in the story that Meriam shared of Gemma, or the kind of the sharing the context in the Philippines from which so many of those who care for us come from. There is just so much that you've shared that it kind of comes together to a lot of the inequalities were there, and it seems almost overwhelming. Like, not only were they there before, now the pandemic has made them worse. So I guess my final question for you is forward-looking, and even though so much of what you have shared seems so big and bleak and hard to take in, but my question is, where could we go from here? You know, like we've seen these trends, you know, of women and racialized workers suffering more job losses, lagging in recovery, women being more responsible for care, knowing, you know, what kinds of workers are more likely to be in these jobs. What are some trends that you are seeing out of this, but also in the conversations that are happening, because we now all see these problems and inequalities just, you know, under a brighter, harsher light? And what is the one big change, you know, if you prefer that question, like what is the one big change you would like to see for women, or in your sector, or in your area of work or expertise in the post-COVID world that's hopefully just around the corner, sort of? Meriam, I'll ask you to go first on this one, followed by Naomi, and then Rebecca.
Well, we've been talking already that the pandemic has exposed all of these inequalities, but it has existed already. That's Jenna's story right there. But at the same time, it has kindled that passion and awareness among, not only among advocates, but ordinary workers who are sometimes low information voters, or does not really pay attention to the day-to-day politics. So the big change that I really want to see right now is that there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, even with this pandemic, because you can see a change in narratives. The Black Lives Matter change a lot. The events, the cultural shift, you can feel it, you can see it. And even when I was speaking to Gemma, she was so happy when I approached her again, because she's been my friend for quite some time. But we had to reconnect because I remember her story. So I asked her permission to tell her story, and she was so happy. And one of her motivation is that she wants me to say it to the world, and so that the media can pick it up, because they've already been planning to expose this to the media. And the fact that they're saying that when they are emboldened, because people are talking about this bias and discrimination, and how the backlash of the Cargill meat packing plant workers and the Filipino backlash, why that they are spreading the disease within the meat packing plants, and the government rhetoric, for example, that that is something that awakens us as migrant workers. And at the same time, it's time to just talk about race and the intersections of immigration and gender and all the isms that is causing all of these inequalities. So there's backlash, because we know in the US, so, well, there's what happened in the US may happen in Canada if we are not going to guard our rights, we're not going to be vigilant about it. So the quality of leaders that we elect, and who we decide to lead us to get out of this pandemic and thereafter, and how the post-pandemic is very crucial. Oh, one more thing. Since we are in the nonprofit, when we talk about the gender equality and racism and bias in the workplace, we also need to check our own backyard on how we treat women, pay equity issue. For example, I have this classmate at Maxwell Public Policy Institute right now. He's doing a study specifically on nonprofits and women and the pay equity issue, and I think it's cool. So a lot of this, the students, out of 25 of us, there's only one male and the rest are 24. So that says a lot that women are rocking the world.
Naomi, thank you, Meriam.
Great. So when I think about the pandemic, and there's a lot to unpack in this question, I think. my hope is that maybe, a small silver lining from the pandemic is that people are sort of starting to care about care, at least to a slightly greater extent. Certainly we still associate both paid and unpaid care work with kind of quote unquote women's work. That has not changed, but we do hear people talking a lot more about a need to recognize the importance of essential labor. We go back to that kind of so-called hero pay that we saw for grocery workers in most of the major chains at the start of the pandemic. It's certainly hugely problematic that that was taken away, but I think it was perhaps an initial indication or recognition that, essential workers are taking on, risk and hardship, especially during the pandemic, just basically so the rest of us can go about our daily lives. And I think that maybe there is more conversation now about the need for a living wage, the need for food security, for housing security, for specifically paid sick leave. And this will have implications disproportionately for women and for women who are made marginalized. Now, the question, of course, is whether this increased conversation is going to lead to concrete policy actions, to changes that impact people's daily lives. And, that does remain an open question. But I think that we can't just look at this kind of in isolation. So we can't just say, we need to pay healthcare aides more money. And of course we do. That's, pay is the number one thing that impacts people's kind of ability to live their lives and support their families and communities. But we also need to think about it more structurally in terms of how we want to reconfigure our health and social care systems. So here I'm talking about, we need public and universal long-term care, childcare. We need pharmacare, even though it looks like as of today, that is not going to be a priority of our government. We need to ensure that people have unionized workplaces so they're protected as workers. And we need greater accountability and transparency mechanisms for government when we think about both public and private institutions. So we need to have these structures in place so that women can thrive both in paid work as well as at home doing unpaid labor. So in thinking about, trying to be optimistic about this, I am encouraged, for example, by the new guidelines that came out suggesting that racialized individuals from certain affected communities are going to be prioritized for the vaccine rollout. As I said before, I'm encouraged by increased race-based data collection, the prioritization of essential healthcare workers for the vaccine rollout. All of this is kind of a necessary precondition to us moving to a more, to a more kind of just post-pandemic world. But if I was to focus on one thing, and I think this draws on what both Meriam and Rebecca are saying, I really do think it is universal, high quality and accessible childcare. I think this is the thing that we will really impact the most women. And this means paying childcare workers fair wages and having these be jobs that we consider skilled jobs. And again, it's disproportionately women of color that do these jobs. But it also will have a huge impact for all women that have children at home or, have family members with children at home and enable them to participate more equally within the paid labor force. So try and kind of address in some way this kind of low labor force participation that we've seen has really gotten very stark since the start of the pandemic. But of course, I think even as I might focus on advocating and thinking about how we can get universal, high quality, accessible paid childcare, we also need to think about this in conjunction with making sure that people have a safe place to live, have a community, have food on the table, and are able to live, free from violence and discrimination. So even as I might focused on childcare, if there was one thing to think about, I think we have to view this within a context of fundamentally reimagining our society so that we can really recognize the care that women are providing, both for pay as well as unpaid within their homes. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Rebecca.
I'm so sorry I'm in the dark now. I have asked them to turn the lights back on, but they are not doing it. So I am not in control of this building.
We can still see you.
Yeah, for the light of my actual computer, thank goodness.
Yes.
Anyways, I'm really excited to hear that we have some similar goals and that there's, advocacy, even if it's outside of the childcare field. I think that has become increasingly clear in the pandemic that childcare is not just a childcare issue, that it's not just about those people who have children. It's not just about those people that work in the field. It really is a huge contributor to economic growth, to gender equality, to any number of issues, whether whoever you are. And we know in other parts of the world that it is far further along in developing, a system that actually works for the people. But now I can't see my notes either, so that's, sorry, flying by the seat of my pants a bit. But so I think when we talk about trends, it's the same. It's the same that Meriam and both Naomi have said, that the recognition for those working in the care field has always been low. Historically, it is not recognized as something of value, but more or less something that you should do if you have compassion for humankind, and that a trait that's often thought of as a female trait. And we see that a lot in the educator field, that if you have an inkling towards children, or you have the ability to have children, that therefore you should be able to do this job. And the fact of the matter says that, maybe you can, but not without support and education to do it right and to provide that quality care. So I think if I had to talk about positive trends, the recognition for childcare and the importance in the economy, that's a really big thing for us. And to even hear it be mentioned in things like the throne speech a couple of weeks ago, or even that the federal government has acknowledged that there should be a workforce strategy. So, and that the money that they would like to give provinces should be put towards a workforce strategy. So that's a really big thing that's happening for us. And I guess if the one big thing I could wish for would be that Alberta would first of all accept that money and do with it something appropriate for the workforce. But clearly that is something that isn't always a priority, and the ability to say yes or no to the money, what depending on the conditions, is stressful, because the federal government has clearly outlined a lot of their values and beliefs alongside what the field is saying, and Alberta is not necessarily on the same page. So yes, I mean, what we really need is a universal childcare national system that works through all these different things, including the workforce as that pillar for success. And they don't have these band-aid solutions like the critical worker benefit. It's not to say that they haven't been helpful, but that they're not a long-term plan, and it's expensive. The $25 a day initiative was expensive. The critical worker benefit is expensive. And so it's just about where you're putting that investment and how can it best be used. And finally, there are things coming forward about the workforce and more research being done. And like Naomi said, there is a huge gap in understanding the workforce, even specific to early childhood educators. There's not a lot out there. And the data is diverse or dated. The stats that I have are from 2012, and that isn't even all encompassing of the whole workforce. It's the 20% that actually had the capability to respond to a survey, because information isn't getting passed down to the workers. That it's stopping at various levels. So I think, yeah, the dream is the national childcare system with the workforce as as the forefront to moving forward. But if I had a quick ask, would be to better spend dollars on solutions that are long-term. And I know that that's a hard sell for many governments to think about in the future, because that's not in their elected official viewpoint to think about what's happening 10 years down the road. It's about thinking about getting reelected, or what's happening right now with this year's budget, which we will get tomorrow, which I'm sure is everyone on top of everyone's mind about what that's going to look like.
Exactly.
You know, so I
You're
mean,
almost
there's
up.
the dream.
Yeah. Okay, well,
I'm done.
Well, thank you all so much, Rebecca, Meriam, Naomi, for generously sharing your thoughts, expertise, experience, and dreams. Right? I feel like in this last response, these are my questions. So I don't have any more questions for you. I'm going to open it up to the attendees' questions. But I would say that in your last, as you were answering this last question, we were getting some questions in the chat, and I feel like you've touched on some of that. People were asking, what is it, like what are some small, more practical, immediate ways that we can, support those in care work, what needs to be done, some bigger questions. So I feel like you've answered some of them, but I'm gonna go with this one. I feel like you may have addressed it, but let's see if there's more to say. So do you think that barriers to change remain in place because we fundamentally as a society still believe women should do the unpaid or undervalued and underpaid work? And what reflections can you make in how we change mindsets in order to create that long-term change? So maybe for you, Naomi?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the first part of the question is easy. I think, yes, I think absolutely the association of care work with women's work is fundamentally part of why we devalue it. These are jobs that historically women did at home for free. And then as well as, when we had kind of paid servants in some scenarios doing these types of jobs, who again, were disproportionately women of color, immigrant women. And as we've kind of transitioned some of these jobs from the unpaid labor market to the paid labor market, we still fundamentally don't see them as being of equal value as other types of kind of masculine dominated paid jobs. So gender is certainly just kind of a key element in terms of why as a society we just don't value this type of work. And value, as we've talked about, I think can be made different ways. We've talked about job satisfaction, we've talked about having like a safe place to work and that sort of thing, and all of those are very important, but ultimately I think it comes down to finances, right? It comes down to investing in these workers if we value them as a society. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of what we can do concretely to change that, that's of course much harder. I think as Rebecca has really said, what we need for sustained change is long-term investment, and that's something that governments are often reluctant to do because they're very focused on kind of immediate priorities. And we want to invest in long-term care and childcare, in education, because that's the right thing to do to make our society better and more equitable. But also, if we kind of take a neoliberal lens, it will have long-term investments, right? It will lead to better outcomes in terms of women's increased labor force participation. But it is very hard to get to a place where we actually do that investment right up front. So, I think in the short term, we need to make sure that in our own lives, we are paying people who provide care for us appropriately. So kind of, put in action like what we believe in more broadly where possible. And we also need to kind of work with groups that are advocating for this kind of sustained structural change, like the Women's Center. And of course, we need to vote. We need to vote for leaders that also care about these policies, or at least are the most closely associated with our values. But yeah, I certainly am interested to hear what Meriam and Rebecca think about this too.
Yeah, and I would, just to add to this question, like another specific one that was, directed to Rebecca, and that is, what sorts of what sorts of things do we expect from governments? What sort of government focus would help childcare workers and facilities? What is it that that we need to support other than a cultural shift? So yes, please, Rebecca and Meriam, add to Naomi's answer, if you like.
I can take a stab at it. Just in addition to what Naomi has already mentioned, and I really love what she said. To weather the pandemic and this crisis, we need the government to act, or governments to act. And there are actions that only governments can take, and the government's rhetoric is very important. Our communications can shape this robust mandate for critical leadership that you badly need right now. We need to shift this narrative from the personal responsibility that care workers are bound to government responsibility. And if the government responsibility is just not there or goes off the radar, if we don't push for that, especially not right now, we will fail to get the action that we really need. It can also stigmatize these workers, and especially Filipino and other women workers. They can quickly become targets, backlash. That's what we've already seen in response to the crisis. So we need to use, probably when it comes to framing the issue as advocates, to look at, or to say, to frame it as the government is the protector of the people and they're the long-term planners, so we need to hold them accountable. And also our duty to elect the type of leaders who can help us weather this through.
Okay, I have a question here that kind of goes into, just kind of a summarizing the discussion that it's been great, that it has highlighted how race and ethnicity factor into the picture, of this gender division of labor. But the question is also whether some of your experiences, whether in advocacy, community, or research, do you have of the particular impact of issues such as ableism and ageism on women throughout the pandemic? This is kind of directed to all of you.
Well, I have not, but in the other side of the border, one politician was already proclaiming that the seniors are ready to offer their lives in service to the economy, which is really bad. But we do not want to share that kind of rhetoric in Canada. And if we're not going to speak out against it right away, then that will become normalized here as well. So we need to be more vigilant.
Okay, anyone else want to take a stab at that? Whether you have any experiences about the particular impact of ableism or ageism on women throughout the pandemic?
Well, I just say, again, I think I go back to this idea that it's really just made things worse, the pandemic. So I think ableism, so much of the kind of supports that people require with different abilities cost money. And I think that the pandemic has really just led to a scenario where people are struggling to a greater degree and don't necessarily have the supports that they would typically have, or even are able to kind of do, like, even social distancing, if we think about it, is something that is very difficult for a lot of people. And we're seeing outbreaks in homeless shelters all across the country. We're seeing outbreaks for people that are incarcerated. So I think that so many of kind of the ideas behind our social distancing practices are really untenable for people who have different abilities or for elderly people. So this again is leading to a scenario where these inequalities are being exacerbated, and we aren't investing in kind of long-term supports to help people, live their lives in the way that they choose to do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have more questions kind of about the practical things. So the Alberta budget will be tabled on Thursday, tomorrow. And we can also expect a federal budget coming soon in a few weeks, probably, or months. So in light of this discussion about current issues and inequalities and the such incredible insufficiency of current policies, what are the specific things that we should be looking for and wanting to see there and advocate for? Rebecca, would you like to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, a little bit of just coming back to some of the other questions and tying this into it. I thought what both Miriam and Naomi were saying about, the government has to take some responsibility. I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario, at least for the early childhood educator workforce. And that is when we think about care work being associated to women, it also isn't respected in something that you should have prior training or education to be able to do. It's that, we make changes, and we've seen that in various fields, right? We've seen it for teachers, we've seen it for social workers, we've seen it even for dental hygienists, right? Where there becomes a college, there becomes, a professional level of education that you have to bring before you can practice. And then you have to maintain that status by continuing to obtain education and updates of what's going on in the field. And I think that historically that hasn't been present for many of these different fields. And in early childhood specific, with the ability to have an equivalency, you can have a nursing degree and also be a level 2 early childhood educator, which is very frustrating. It's not to say that you can't do the job okay, it's just that you don't have the core competencies to do the job well, which means that you're starting from a place of lesser support, except for you're given the recognition of somebody who has more education, which is very frustrating to have. And I think in bringing forward that recognition for people working in the field, we have to show our commitment to the practice and the education and the knowledge that we obtain to be able to do the work, and keep that up. On the flip side, if you're not going to be paid in a way that reflects having that education, then what is the motivation to continue to do something like that? So I think the fight kind of comes on both sides. If you need the education to do the job well, but then you can't afford to get the education, or you don't have the time or the space or even the respect or the ability, whatever that might be, disability, age, whatever, financial status, that kind of puts barriers on both sides. So how do we advocate to government that we deserve better wages and working conditions when they're not recognizing that we need to have education and core competencies to do the work in the first place? So one of the biggest things that we're advocating for on behalf of early childhood educators is that there is a higher level of education required to practice, or at least to be called an early childhood educator in the first place. So this is a small step that government could have put in their regulations that stated, yes, we welcome everyone to come into this field, and those people that are practicing with an education level that is not maybe a diploma or a degree, here's a pathway for you, here's funding for you, here's a way that we show that we want to keep you here and we appreciate your commitment, but also acknowledge that you need to have this support and this basis to build your practice and to do this job well, and to actually support the population of people that we're trying to serve in the first place. Very similar to like the LPN RN model. And we see that with, people who have diplomas or degrees or EAs and teachers, and it just doesn't exist for us right now. And I think that makes it really complicated to ask for that recognition.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Meriam, I want to go back to you because I feel like earlier you were also saying, you might want to continue and expand on some of what you were saying later on. And we have a question here, from someone that, all the panelists have said that the issues that were not brought on by the pandemic, but more like exacerbated by it. So given that these are new issues, and you've certainly shared a lot of the context and the background for that, the question is kind of like what what needs to be done to produce a real shift, but kind of across major institutions and governments. I know you spoke about cultural change and movements, but in terms of changes across institutions and governments, would you have anything to add there? Or, as I was saying, if you wanted to expand on some things you were saying earlier, kind of in your response to the why question. And that would be our last question of the night, I should say. You're muted, Meriam. Meriam, you're muted.
Well, I talked earlier about the context of how the Philippine government brokers labor to the world, but at the same time, we set them up to fail in a way because they are disadvantaged when you are a temporary foreign worker and you are tied to a single employer visa. For example, if you're a cargo worker, you cannot, if you feel unsafe at your workplace, at a meat packing plant, then you are tied to that single employer visa. You cannot get out of the workplace until you have the permission from your employer. So that's one thing which needs to shift. And why are temporary workers differently treated by institutions and by the structures? That's number one. That's very crucial. At the same time, but that's a national level. There are other ways in which we can advocate for so many vulnerable folks, especially in Alberta. Right now, we're talking about within the Calgary Ability Network to push for something local because that's more doable and we can lobby for that more actively than in the national, is on what the Calgary Ability Network is pushing for right now on disability legislation in the province. It is super important because not only if you are a racialized person and who has a member in the family with disabilities and you're a woman or a single mother, and I know of one, as an example, that the burdens that you'll be facing is like fivefold, tenfold compared to others. But we are not going to compete with all the burdens of what other people are suffering. But we just want to highlight that there are avenues that we can participate in depending on the passion that we share. So in my case, for example, in the national level, temporary foreign workers, removal of that single employer visa would be a huge shift. Aside from the fact that we need to shift as well how we look at the immigrants' role in the Canadian system. We or immigrants or new immigrants are not others. We are part of the Canadian society. We contribute and we have human dignity and we have shared prosperity. So those bigger values, we'd like to push that in order to be more inclusive in our advocacy.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our speakers, Meriam Bravante, Rebecca Leong, and Naomi Lightman. Thank you really for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your hopes, and many ideas for change with us, ideas small and big. Thank you to all the attendees for your attention and for the questions. I just wanted to mention that if you want to view the event as a recording, we'll be sending a follow-up email with that information. And once again, I would like to invite you to follow just to follow us and to check out our follow-up events in April and May and further, and join us in this discussion. Join us in the discussion on how do we fundamentally reimagine our society so that we can take big and small steps and basically restore, take all kinds of steps that we need to restore the dignity and fair compensation and recognition to all kinds of work that sustain us as people. So I want to say, watch our calendar for that, but also for more of our social, environmental, and Indigenous issues discussions in 2021. Thank you so much to the three of you, and thank you to everyone who was here tonight. And have a good rest of your night.